Darkness is my closest friend. Darkness is my closest friend. Let that sink in for a second. Darkness is my closest friend. Now you might be wondering, this is really in the Bible? This is one of the Psalms? You might be asking in your head, preacher, this is the conference of worship the Lord, and you chose this text? Or maybe you might be thinking that there has to be something yet to come in this text. God has to do something, respond. Maybe there's something about a saving God or a healing God. But no, that's not what we have here. The psalmist definitely isn't someone going to church and standing up and singing that he is a friend of God. He is a friend of God. No. This psalmist ain't doing that. This psalmist gets past it all and goes straight to the heart of what he needs to say. You could even say that this speaker gets past all the BS and gets exactly at what he has to say. He cries out in desperation to God. And these are his final words. Darkness is my closest friend. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with this psalm, the world-class scholar Walter Brueggemann puts it as a psalm of disorientation. This psalm is a psalm of lament. Lament being the crying out of the people of God to God as worship. It is a calling out to God in their disorientation to remind God that he is a God of reorientation. But this psalm, Psalm 88, isn't like the typical lament psalms that you might find in the book of Psalms. This psalm does not end resolved. It isn't like even Job's laments in the book of Job where God shows up in a whirlwind. No. It, in fact, is only one of two psalms that end in disorientation, that end seemingly unresolved. It is a psalm that ends in waiting, that ends in darkness. Although this psalm is unique in the corpus of the biblical canon, it should not be unique or foreign to us. This psalm speaks to the reality of life. A man cries out to God in verses 1 and 2, "O Lord, God of my salvation, when at night I cry out in your presence, let my prayer come before you. Incline your ear to me." This is a man crying out because he describes his very experience. His present condition as being in the pits. He describes his life as hell on earth. When I read this text, I see a man who's pacing back and forth, crying out, seemingly unto an empty sky. He goes on in his pacing to barrage God with statements and questions. With his eyes filled with sorrow, he wonders why God has hid his face from him. He wonders why he hears nothing from God. The psalmist speaks an onslaught upon God so that God must respond. There is no buddying up to God. There is no easy talk. No, this psalmist skips the niceties and gets straight to the heart of it. He is experiencing hell on earth. He demands in the midst of his experience to know where God is in the midst of that. And the psalmist ends disoriented. The psalmist ends with darkness as his closest friend. In reflecting on these final words of the psalmist, I couldn't help but recall that famous 1968 song, "The Sound of Silence," written by Paul Simon and performed by both Simon and Garfunkel. In an eerie tone, Simon starts the song with the same words as the psalmist in Psalm 88. Hello, darkness, my old friend. I've come to talk to you again. The song goes on to articulate the emotions of despair. The song goes on to put the words that darkness is now his closest friend. Now, for the exact reason of why Simon wrote this song, we are unknown. But much like the psalmist we read today, some speculate about what Paul Simon was experiencing. Some say that he wrote the song as an articulation of the Americans' experience after John F. Kennedy's assassination in 1963. Now, this could be a case, but in an interview, Simon gives insight into what he was actually trying to do in the song. He said, "I used to go off when I was 21 in the bathroom to play. Because the bathroom had tiles, it was sort of an echo chamber. I'd turn on the faucet so that the water would run. It was a sound that was soothing to me. And then I'd play, in the dark. Hello, darkness, my old friend." You see, Simon understood something profound. The same thing that the psalmist that we just read understood. He would sing songs of disorientation because there was a comfort that was brought to him in that disorientation. That in the midst of the dark bathroom where darkness was his friend, Simon would be comforted by the words of lament. Simon and the psalmist weren't all that different. Now, if I was to be honest with you today, when I first read this text, it dearly troubled me, and I hope it would you as well. It first of all troubled me that I honestly had never heard it in the church. In the church today, I had never heard it once read, preached on, or even heard a hymn that was sung about it. And if I had to guess, I'm sure you're probably in the same boat. The more and more I was troubled, I realized something, that our church today has a lament problem. And it's not a problem of lamenting too much, no. It's a problem that our churches don't have space to lament at all. Wow. And in reflecting on the song Sound of Silence and the psalmist, I find myself even more troubled. I find that the secular world seems to do this lament thing better than the church. In a world where we see mass shootings come across the news cycle, what seems like weekly, in a world where depression and anxiety are at an all-time high, in a world where our political discourse revolves around the president tweeting about whether someone sits, kneels, or stands during a national anthem, and not about the actual violence or the racism that plagues our public institutions, in a world where children and women are exploited and trafficked on the very streets we walk on and drive on, in a world where people put guns to their head with shaking hands, pondering to take their own life. In this world, I have to wonder something. Where is our space to lament? Where do we have space to worship like God the way this psalmist does in Psalm 88? Where do we have space to sing songs like Paul Simon's song? Where do we have space to experience the comfort of crying out in the darkness, to say, darkness is my closest friend? Because that's what our text is about. It is found in a book about worship. Here resides a text where someone can articulate that feeling that so many of us know so well. A text where someone can be honest and truthful about the despair in which they are experiencing and tell God this to expect a response. And that's the good news of the text. The good news is surely that it exists. It gives voice to the needed act of worship called lament. Because when darkness is our closest friend, the church should be the first place that we go to cry out unto God and say that. Let me conclude with this. Walter Brueggemann, in his book, The Message of the Psalms, recalls a story from the book Sophie's Choice to highlight the importance of this song. There was a man named Stingo in this book who was having an anxiety attack on a bus in which he was on his way from Washington, D.C. to New York. His hands were shaking. His eyes were hollowed out because he was on his way to bury his two closest friends who had recently committed suicide. In the midst of his visible despair, a black woman who he did not know came and sat down beside him on that bus. She looked at him and asked, "Why are you crying? Has somebody done hurt you bad?" And the man in his despair could not muster a response. So this black woman sees this man's need and offers him her possible best gift that she has to offer. Psalm 88. Words of comfort for this man's ears. Words of worship. In fact, they were likely the only words that could have been words of comfort for this man. Because easy words could not have been words of comfort for this man's experiencing of darkness as his friend. No, only the words of Psalm 88 could bring him comfort. So in the midst of not hearing from God, in the midst of silence, may we remember this psalm. May we be comforted by its word like this man on his gloomy bus ride. May we be comforted by these words like Paul Simon who sings them in a dark bathroom. May we remember to not be too quick to give easy, comforting, cheap words, but may we be real. Real about all that we are experiencing in the world. May we, as the church, worship God with the words of lament. May we cry out to God in worship, and in the midst of our despair, say that darkness is our closest friend. And then, like this psalmist, and all that have come before him, we will wait in anticipation for God to respond.